In the heart of Igbo land, where the earth bore the weight of centuries-old legends, Adaobi had always felt out of place. The sprawling village of Umuokwe, surrounded by the thick canopies of the ancient rainforest and the rhythmic pulse of the river flowing like the veins of the earth, was a land steeped in an unyielding adherence to tradition. It was a place where customs were not merely followed but ingrained into the very fabric of the people. To question them was to invite scorn. To challenge them was to be marked as a traitor to the ancestors, to the gods, and to the very essence of Igbo identity. But Adaobi was no ordinary daughter. She was the only child of Ozo Ugochukwu, a man whose name was uttered with a mixture of awe and trepidation throughout the region. A chief of immense influence and power, Ugochukwu was the embodiment of Igbo tradition. His word was law, his decisions final, and his disdain for modernity as deep as the chasms between the old gods and the new ones. To him, the traditions of their ancestors were sacred, untouchable, immutable. His was a lineage that had ruled the village for generations, and in his eyes, no force could, nor should, ever disrupt that harmony. Yet, in Adaobi's soul, a storm had long been brewing. From the moment she could speak, she had rebelled against the suffocating expectations that surrounded her. While her peers were taught to sew, to cook, to be dutiful wives and mothers, Adaobi was restless. She craved knowledge that was beyond the narrow confines of her prescribed role. She thirsted for a truth that was buried beneath layers of patriarchal doctrine and ritual. In her heart, she had the call of something far grander than the life she was being molded for. In a land where the ancestors were worshipped with reverence and the elders' words were considered the ultimate authority, the very idea of challenging these principles was considered blasphemous. But Adaobi could not ignore the gnawing sense that the world her father clung to was one built on a foundation of sand. The women were not meant to speak out. The youth were meant to listen and obey. But Adaobi, to her father's great disappointment, refused to be silent. And this defiance, this yearning for something more than what she had been taught, was about to ignite a fire that could burn the very essence of her village to the ground. It was during the eve of the new moon, a time of darkness that held a certain weight in the village, that the winds of change first began to stir. A visitor came from the distant city, where the clamor of progress drowned out the whispers of ancient gods. Nnamdi was his name, a man whose very presence seemed to challenge everything Adaobi had known. His reputation had preceded him. A son of the metropolis, he was an intellectual, an idealist, and a revolutionary. He was not a man of war, but of words, and his very ideas held the power to unravel the tightly knit strands of tradition that had bound the villagers for centuries. Nnamdi had heard of the village, of its rich history, its resistance to change, and its stubborn adherence to practices that had long outlived their usefulness. He had come to speak, to awaken the minds of those willing to listen, to plant the seed of a revolution that would not be fought with blades, but with ideas, with the power of the mind to reshape the future. Adaobi had heard rumors of this gathering long before it arrived. Whispers spread like wildfire across the village, talk of a new way, of a better future. But she knew better than to believe the rumors. The village had no use for outsiders who came to challenge the status quo. The elders, especially her father, would never tolerate it. They believed in the sanctity of their customs. And yet, Adaobi's heart raced with anticipation. She knew this gathering could change everything. That evening, under the canopy of 1,000 stars, Adaobi slipped silently into the meeting. The clearing where the elders convened was surrounded by towering trees whose gnarled roots seemed to reach down into the earth as if trying to grasp onto the past. She knew that no one would expect her to be there, but she could not stay away. The air was thick with tension, a palpable energy that hummed through the night. Nnamdi stood at the center of the gathering, his posture rigid yet relaxed, his eyes alight with the fire of someone who believed in the power of transformation. He spoke with a fervor that Adaobi had never before encountered. His words cut through the night like a blade, each sentence carrying with it the weight of 1,000 truths that had been hidden beneath layers of history and doctrine. We cannot remain shackled to a past that no longer serves us, Nnamdi declared, his voice strong and unwavering. The world outside these walls is changing. The winds of modernity are blowing, and they will not stop for the sake of tradition. The question is, will we stand firm and break these barriers, or will we remain trapped in a cage of our own making? Adaobi's pulse quickened. It was not the words themselves that struck her, but the conviction with which he spoke. There was power in his voice, a magnetic pull that drew her in. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, a stirring, an awakening. For the first time, she saw the possibility of something beyond the narrow confines of her existence. The elders, including her father, sat in stunned silence. Ozo Ugochukwu's eyes narrowed as he studied Nnamdi, his mind racing to process the implications of what was being said. He knew that this man, this outsider, was dangerous. His ideas were a threat to everything he had fought to preserve. To him, the traditions of their people were sacrosanct. The very idea of questioning them was an affront to the gods themselves. But Adaobi could no longer remain silent. The words of Nnamdi reverberated in her mind like a drumbeat. She could not ignore the call any longer. She stood from her hidden place in the shadows and stepped into the clearing, her presence a challenge to everything that had been. I agree with him, Adaobi's voice rang out, clear and steady. Her heart pounded in her chest as all eyes turned to her. Our traditions are no longer enough. The world is changing, and we must change with it. Her father's eyes flared with fury. His voice, usually a calm and steady force, now crackled with anger. You are my daughter, Adaobi. You have forgotten your place. You have forgotten your duty to the gods, to our ancestors. Your words are treasonous. But Adaobi was resolute. The words of her father, once a source of comfort, now felt like chains. If it is treason to seek a better future, then I will be a traitor. But I will not stand by and watch as my people remain bound to a past that no longer serves us. The tension in the air was unbearable. Adaobi's words hung like a storm cloud, and the elders, her father included, knew that nothing would ever be the same. A shift had occurred, one that could never be undone. And with that shift, the path to revolution, one not of violence. In the days that followed, Adaobi and Nnamdi's ideas spread like wildfire across the village. The young and the restless listened. The elders, though resistant, could not ignore the growing groundswell of dissent. The winds of change were blowing stronger, and no one knew whether they would scatter the ashes of the past or create a storm that would burn everything to the ground. As Adaobi stood at the precipice of a new era, she realized that the battle was far from over. It had only just begun. And in this war for the soul of her village, there would be no winners, only those who dared to break the barriers that had long kept them confined. Adaobi had crossed a threshold that could never be undone. The words she had spoken, unbidden, bold, had rippled through the village like an earthquake. Her father, Ozo Ugochukwu, had retreated to his chambers, his face a mask of simmering rage, while the elders gathered in hushed tones, no longer certain of the unshakable power they had once held. Adaobi knew that the path she had set foot upon was fraught with peril. Her own bloodline, her father's name, everything she had once revered, was now in jeopardy. But she had tasted the freedom of thought, and she would not let it slip through her fingers. In the days that followed, her interactions with her father grew increasingly strained. His disappointment, once veiled in silence, now manifested in sharp words and cold glares. Adaobi could feel the weight of his gaze as it followed her throughout the house, his presence a constant reminder of the ancient expectations that shackled her every move. Yet, no matter how hard he tried to break her spirit, she held firm. Nnamdi, meanwhile, became both a beacon and a threat. His presence in the village was a constant reminder of the future that loomed just beyond their grasp. Adaobi found herself drawn to him, not just because of his convictions, but because he understood her in ways no one else did. He was not afraid to speak of change, to challenge the status quo, to tear down the walls that kept people bound by fear. To Adaobi, he was the embodiment of the rebellion she felt stirring in her soul. "You were right," Adaobi confessed one evening, standing before him in the shadows of the old village temple. "I thought it was enough, that following the old ways would give me purpose. But I've realized I've been living someone else's life." Nnamdi smiled softly, his eyes gleaming with a knowing light. "It's the hardest realization, Adaobi. But once you see the truth, it's impossible to unsee." Adaobi's heart raced as she considered his words. The battle ahead would not just be with her father or the elders. It would be with every person who had ever been taught to obey without question. The weight of tradition was heavier than any stone, and she had no idea how she might ever move it. The first sign of open resistance came in the form of a council meeting that Ozo Ugochukwu called for in the village square. Word spread quickly, there was a reckoning coming. The chief had summoned the elders to decide Adaobi's fate. Nnamdi was a dangerous man, his ideas a poison that had infected the minds of the young. And Adaobi, his willing disciple, had become the face of that poison. The elders, many of whom had grown old in the service of the gods and ancestors, were restless. They had heard the rumors of the growing discontent, of the whispers in the market, in the shadows. But now, it was time to decide how to deal with the cancer that threatened their very existence. Adaobi stood at the center of the square, her posture unwavering as the village's most influential figures gathered before her. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the earth, marking the beginning of an era that would either end in transformation or destruction. Her father, ever the stoic figure, sat on his elevated platform, his eyes filled with a quiet fury. "You have chosen your path, daughter," Ozo Ugochukwu said, his voice cold as the mountain winds. "But know this, the weight of our ancestors lies upon your shoulders. If you choose to betray them, there will be no place for you here. The gods do not forgive those who forsake their lineage." Adaobi's voice rang clear, steady in the face of his threats. "I do not betray them, Father. I honor them by seeking a future that is not bound by the chains of the past. The gods will not forsake us, for we are their children, too. And we must grow." Her words hung in the air, met by silence. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, their brows furrowed in disbelief. Adaobi could feel the weight of their judgment upon her, but she stood firm, the fire in her chest burning brighter than the fear that had once gripped her. Ozo Ugochukwu rose, his massive form casting a shadow over her as he descended the stairs. The air between them crackled with tension. "You have chosen rebellion," he spat, his voice a venomous whisper. "And in rebellion, you will find nothing but sorrow. The village will never accept what you preach, Adaobi. And if you insist on following this dangerous path, then you will stand alone." Adaobi's heart thundered in her chest, but her eyes met his with unwavering conviction. I would rather stand alone, father, than live in chains. As the council dispersed, the elders went their separate ways, leaving the square in an uneasy quiet. The battle lines were drawn, and Adaobi knew that the war was no longer one of words but of actions. She had chosen her side, and now the consequences would unfold. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of covert meetings, clandestine gatherings, and whispered conversations in dark corners. Adaobi and Nnamdi worked tirelessly to spread their message. The youth, hungry for change, rallied around them. The older generations, however, remained entrenched in their ways. Yet Adaobi could sense the cracks beginning to appear in the walls of tradition. More and more villagers began to question the authority of the elders, the suffocating rules that governed every aspect of their lives. The winds of change, though slow at first, were gaining momentum. But the cost of rebellion was steep. Ozo Ugochukwu's wrath was swift and merciless. He had sent his emissaries throughout the surrounding villages, gathering support for his cause, ensuring that Adaobi's descent would not spread beyond the borders of Umuokwe. His influence was far-reaching, and the village that had once been a home now felt like a prison. One fateful evening, as Adaobi and Nnamdi sat by the flickering fire, plotting their next move, the sound of footsteps echoed through the quiet night. It was not the soft, familiar footfalls of a friend. This was a presence that could only signify one thing: danger. Before Adaobi could react, a figure appeared from the shadows, her father's trusted servant, Obinna. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "They are coming for you," he whispered urgently. "Your father has sent men to arrest you. The village is no longer safe. You must leave now." In that moment, Adaobi realized that the time for words had ended. The revolution she had ignited was no longer a dream of change, it was a battle for her very life. The elders would not allow her to dismantle the walls they had spent a lifetime building. And her father. He would stop at nothing to see her broken and silenced. The weight of her decision hit Adaobi with full force. There was no turning back now. The path she had chosen had no guarantees, no promises of victory. Only the uncertainty of the unknown. With Nnamdi at her side, she fled into the night, her heart torn between the love she had once felt for her village, her family, and the unrelenting pull of a future that was hers to shape. She knew that the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but she also knew that it was the only road worth walking. The night was dark, the forest thick with the weight of uncertainty as Adaobi and Nnamdi made their escape. The whispers of the village seemed to fade as they ventured further from the place that had once been her world. Her heart was heavy, torn between the love she felt for the land of her ancestors and the undeniable truth that the path of change had already been set in motion. Days turned into weeks as they traveled far from Umuokwe, seeking refuge in distant lands. They found shelter in neighboring villages, places where the weight of tradition wasn't as stifling, where the voices of rebellion had room to breathe. Adaobi began to see the fruits of her labor. Others had begun to follow in her footsteps, carrying the torch of change with the same fire that had once burned in her own chest. The youth, inspired by her defiance, had begun to question the very fabric of their upbringing, their beliefs, and their future. But even as the seeds of revolution took root, Adaobi knew that her fight was far from over. Her father's influence was vast, and he would never stop pursuing her, never cease in his efforts to reclaim his daughter and restore the order he believed was his right to command. In the weeks that passed, the whispers from her homeland grew louder. A movement was stirring in Umuokwe. It was not just the youth who were rallying behind Adaobi's message, but the elders themselves, torn between their loyalty to the old ways and the undeniable truth that change was inevitable. Adaobi had become a symbol of something greater than herself, a beacon for those who had been silenced for too long. Then, one fateful day, a messenger arrived with a letter from the village. It was from the elder council, and it was a summons. Return to Umuokwe, Adaobi. The village has been torn apart by your absence, and the weight of the past grows unbearable. We are at a crossroads. If you do not return, your father will make decisions that will fracture us beyond repair. Come home. Help us find a way forward. For the first time in months, Adaobi felt a flicker of hope. The village, her people, had finally begun to acknowledge what she had seen all along. The change they so desperately needed was within reach, but it could only happen if they were willing to embrace the future, not just cling to the past. She and Nnamdi made their way back, their hearts filled with equal parts fear and anticipation. The journey was long, but Adaobi knew that it was not only her future on the line, it was the future of everyone in Umuokwe. She could no longer run. She would return and face the reckoning that awaited her. When she finally stepped foot in the village once more, the air was thick with tension. The villagers gathered in the square, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and cautious optimism. The elders had come to terms with the truth: the old ways could not stand forever. There was no going back. Ozo Ugochukwu stood before her, his face lined with years of pride and grief. His eyes were hard, but there was a flicker of something softer beneath the surface, something that had long been buried. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, Adaobi met her father's gaze and saw not just the chief of the village, but the man who had raised her, loved her, and shaped her into the woman she had become. "I did not want this, Adaobi," he said, his voice breaking with the weight of regret. "I wanted to protect you, to keep you safe from the dangers of change. But I see now that you are right. You were never meant to be confined by the walls I built. And for that, I am sorry." Adaobi stepped forward, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. "It is not just me, Father. It is all of us. We have all been bound by a past that has no place in our future. We must let go of our fear and embrace the unknown." For a long moment, there was silence. The elders, the villagers, all watched with bated breath as the weight of the moment hung in the air. And then, something miraculous happened. One by one, the elders stood and nodded, their faces softened with understanding. The old chief, once a pillar of unwavering tradition, finally stepped down from his elevated position and took his daughter's hand. "You have taught us well, Adaobi," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The future belongs to those who dare to dream of it." And in that moment, everything changed. The village of Umuokwe, once bound by the chains of the past, had finally broken free. The following weeks were filled with discussions, debates, and challenges. Adaobi worked with the elders to redefine the traditions that had shaped their lives for so long. They didn't discard the past, but they reshaped it, weaving it into a future that respected the wisdom of their ancestors while also embracing the promise of progress. Adaobi's vision was now shared by her people. The young men and women who had once been oppressed by the roles they were given began to find their voices. Women like Adaobi were no longer shadows in their own homes, they were leaders, speakers, and architects of change. And as the days passed, the village grew stronger. There was no one moment, no grand celebration, that marked their victory. It was in the quiet conversations under the stars, in the smiles exchanged between father and daughter, in the laughter of children who now looked forward to a world filled with endless possibilities. Years later, Adaobi would stand on the same hill where she had once first questioned the world around her. She was no longer just the daughter of Ozo Yugachukwu. She was the leader of a people who had found their way forward, who had dared to break the barriers that had held them back for generations. And as she looked out over the village, now thriving and united, she knew that the future she had fought for was not just a dream. It was real, and it was theirs. In the end, Adaobi's victory was not just in the changes she had wrought, but in the legacy she had created, a legacy that would inspire generations to come, a testament to the power of breaking barriers, of defying the odds, and of shaping a future that belonged to all,